Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. My name is Amber Case, and I'll be talking a little bit about calm technology and human scale design. And of course, I would like to make a land statement that I am in Portland, Oregon on stolen land. And there have been many tribes on this land: Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Olalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River and worked with the land instead of against it. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of the land on which I'm presenting from and on which I make my home. I'm very interested in history. I'm especially interested in history and technology because at some point I think we got dissolved from the idea that technology and tools were the same thing, that the arts and the sciences somehow became separated. And I'd like to reestablish a kind of historical perspective of technology and remind the many of us that build technology that we are still working with nature. We're still working with nature's laws, and we're still working with the entire history of tool use and where those tools came from. And when I look at some of the other histories, like the idea that we're all cyborgs, that our best machines are made of sunshine, these terms don't come from film. They don't come from Terminator or RoboCop. They come from, in this case, a paper on space travel. A cyborg is anybody to which an exogenous component has been added for the purpose of adapting to a new environment. So anytime you're adding something to yourself to go into space, but anytime in the history of humanity that you've added something to yourself to extend your fist or extend your teeth through the use of a knife, you're a cyborg. And this idea that we're separate from technology or that we're separate from nature makes no sense because we've always grown up alongside our tools. And I think one of the most fundamental flaws in our history of technology and our history of tools is that we sent traditional anthropologists to other countries to study the anthropological other. The anthropological other was, we never understood that here are people who've taken care of land for like 5,000 or 1,000,000 years, who fundamentally understand the geography, the tools, how to work with the environment, are incredibly technologically sophisticated, and have a way of passing that information down generation to generation without the need for white papers and servers and things like that, just through ritual and tradition and ceremony. And we wrote them up and we put them in books, and we forgot to look at a couple different ideas. We forgot to look at our own selves in that perspective, and we forgot to look at all the other different perspectives. For instance, Afrofuturism. I have a poster of Sun Ra on my wall, and I just look at it every day. Remember that there are other narratives, and if we only have one, we miss out on all the technology innovation and interesting insights into the future. The other idea is this concept of Cosmotechnics. Now, this essay came out fairly recently, The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay on Cosmotechnics. Now, Cosmotechnics, loosely defined, is the idea that every culture has their own technology. If you go to Japan, it's very obvious that there's this own specific technology. In Japan, it grew out of their history of technology. So when Japan decided to automate something, it was, here's a traditional sliding door. Then during automation, it was, here's an automatic sliding door. There was still a connection to that history and that culture. Now, if we think that most of our technology, that technology is built a certain way, like a social network, for instance, and that most of that has been built in Silicon Valley, and then if we're going to do that in China or India, that it should look the same way, that one society sets those standards, we miss out on all of the different ways that we could interact with technology. There's been a history of people considering what technology could look like in the future. One of my favorites is the Mason meetings on cybernetics, and these went for about 20 years. There were anthropologists, there were technologists, and they worried about the ethics. They said, you know, at some point these computers will be smaller, they'll be part of our lives. What will it mean as they retreat in size and increase in power? Now, we don't talk about these in our talks. It's either a talk about the future of technology or we talk about, you know, how people don't care about ethics and they're so important. But very rarely do we see social scientists, artists, and technologists get together and hang out with each other. And when we have seen a lot of advancements in general innovation. So a cyborg anthropologist just looks at the real world and says, how strange we are. How strange that we sleep next to our devices and they cry and we pick them up and have to soothe them back to sleep. They get hungry and we have to plug them into the wall. That we look at these devices before we look at our significant other in the morning. Why and how did all these devices get into our lives anyway? I think one of the reasons is this idea of non-places from sociologist Mark Auger. He said that a place is something where you have history and relation to other people and identity. And in a modern society, especially with, in the United States at least, Robert Moses coming in and making all of these big highways and destroying lots of ethnic communities, the idea was speed. Let's go from one place to the other. Let's have a paved road. Let's have suburbs. Let's have modernity. That everything in the future is better than everything in the past. And now these same people with their suburbs escape to Europe to see history when they have a chance because they want to be at human scale. So when we took away human scale and we put people in non-places like traffic jams, airports, supermarket lines, we saw that people wanted to get back in touch with each other. They wanted to make a place in a non-place. And to do that, they used their phones as a kind of techno-social wormhole. The idea that you could connect from point A to point B, that your phone was more of a place than the traffic jam that you were in, than the suburbs you were in, than the large row of undifferentiated condos, of the buildings, the architecture, and the food, and the music, and the culture that all look the same. We wanted to connect, and so it became the norm that everybody had their cell phone in their pocket, that mobile, almost cell phone as a cigarette, a completion of social relation. Now that a lot of us are locked in, we have finally become, and other people call this the singularity, but Sheldon Renan calls it homo connectus, that we're finally all almost connected at any point in time. And all of our memories are now hyperlinked as well. That we can access those memories at any time from the cloud, from Google, from different places. And that we've become a kind of society of persistent paleontologists, although a lot of us don't go very deep into that stack. And there's a lot of missing data, especially art, net art from the 90s, for instance. But that there's this idea that we're constantly scraping up old data, remembering the keyword to get to our thought. And sometimes we get distracted by the big pile of dust that's settled onto our inbox. This is the new norm because everybody is binging Netflix. It's not considered hoarding. It's not considered an antisocial behavior. These are norms. And I'm wondering I'm wondering about them in general, like what's the point of them? You know, if in our present day worlds, we have the ability to connect with anyone at any moment, but the architecture under which we participate is very standardized. Early on the web, you would have bulletin board software. You would dial up to something. You would have the well, which was originally for Grateful Dead people, and you would talk about philosophy. Your body was your text. You were anonymous. You could change who you were. You could come of age on Second Life. And now the idea is, instead of experimenting with identity and being more of a cyborg where your gender and your race might not matter because you are just text, you are rendered your full real name, what you look like. And especially on Facebook, it's become a kind of templated self where this is the only way in which you could participate online, not build your own website, build your own world, even though people used to do that a lot more. So I like to think about these kind of persistent architectures. This is Doug Engelbart's first mouse. The even earlier version of this had a foot pedal so that you could scroll down the page. And around that time, everything had a foot pedal. Some of it because of the Spanish flu, but a lot of times, like when you're in a car, there's a foot pedal. Sewing machine has a foot pedal. Trash can has a foot pedal. So many things have foot pedals. And the original mouse had one too. But when the mouse was adapted by IDEO to create the mouse that we have today, it lost that pedal and that kind of vestigial way of interacting with our technology. We don't think about it anymore. We just say, oh, this is the norm, multi-touch or a mouse. We're missing an actual limb in order to interact with our reality. And now we're kind of in multiple time zones. I always think of it like simultaneous jet lag, that all of these interfaces, you kind of have a completed or uncompleted task on each of them. Where's the time for yourself? Where's the time of thinking differently? Where's the perspective where you can step outside of it and say, what am I really doing with my life? Is the thing that we're building at the company the real thing to do? Is it interesting? I think there could be a lot more time for ethics if we could stand outside of this for a moment. The effects that you have on, the effects that this has on your brain are pretty severe. Just the average number of times that someone touches their phone is very, very high. If you are an online dating user, it gets even higher as the kind of roulette wheel that you're pressing. And a lot of times this information is designed to get into your system one type thinking, which is fast and automatic and emotional, and to avoid or bypass that frontal cortex that's slow and deliberate and effortful, the time of, you know, whenever you see somebody who has a completed project and you say, oh, I wish I had completed that, yet there never seems to be enough time in the day to do that. How much of your day is spent in panic versus perspective? Is it possible, even when using technology, to move from your amygdala in the panic zone into your prefrontal cortex where the words are and you can control your emotions? Because we've gotten used to it. And when given the choice, people always take the easier path. Well, always, not always, some people don't. But in reality, real takes time. And the quality of time becomes really, really important. The quality of time was considered by the Greeks. All sorts of cultures have ideas of time. And if you just look back a couple thousand years, it's all over the place. The idea of chronos and kairos time from the Greeks is really interesting. Chronos is this kind of industrialized time. You have a meeting from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. You have to do a certain thing during that meeting. You're thinking in this repeated time. You want to do the same thing on the assembly line. It's a very good time for that, automotive assembly line. But what about the human time? Kairos time is watching a sunset, falling in love, considering first steps when you have a kid, hearing the first words of someone you love. These are really important. These are the things you remember when you're 80 on your deathbed. You don't remember that meeting you were in. You remember that one time when you were present. One way to get back to it is, of course, defragmenting your brain through nature and going into more kairos time, understanding that nature is really varied and fractal. It's good for your brain. Marc Auger, who wrote the story about non-places, has a new kind of essay about tiny joys, just small things. Like when you were a kid, you could stare out the window when the rain was falling and think about things, or you could play with a toy for hours. If we can get back to doing these things, we're not going to be constantly trying to get some meaning from our technology. So right now, we have an era of interruptive technology. And we should be able to choose how much tech we want on our lives. So we need the opposite. We need a kind of calm technology. And if the Macy meetings had anthropologists and technologists alongside each other, Xerox PARC had the same thing. Xerox PARC, which gave us the printer that we know and love, had a research division called Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. And two people, John Seeley Brown and Mark Weiser, along with a bunch of other artists and anthropologists and scientists and weirdos, came together to think about the future of technology. Mark Weiser very quickly understood that technology could be very dangerous. They actually had this active PARC badge that you could walk around with in the company, and it would notice when you walked into the door, and it would start up your computer in the background while you're getting a cup of coffee. They all loved being tracked on these big bulletin boards. Every employee could be tracked by these big bulletin boards. You could see where people were gathering and hang out and see on their project. And Mark said, oh my gosh, if we actually had these things in real life, there would be ethical and privacy concerns. So he wrote papers about it. This is a paper called The Technologist's Responsibilities in Social Change, which is an incredible paper. It's still available online, and it's very prescient. And again, every 10 years, we see privacy and security issues keep popping up. But every single time with more of us in Homo connectus, it's crucial that we take care of these things or people will die. Why is electricity considered dangerous and has standards? That you can't have your house changed around without an electrician. And yet we are building dangerous technology and we don't have standards and standards committees for it. And I think it's because there haven't been a bunch of people that have directly died because of technology. It's not like the Challenger explosion or the Titanic. People kind of die in weird ways, or the idea of kind of class-based structural violence where a bunch of people can't get to the unemployment line and so they eventually die. But it's not this whiz-bang, symbolic, amazing moment like the Titanic that forces the regulation of certain industries and a standard for Morse code. But at least Weiser said, build it as safe as you can and build into it all the safeguards to personal values you could imagine and tell the world at large you're doing something different, dangerous. But of course, it was easier for them to understand because technologists understood a bit of philosophy and art, and artists understood a bit of technology, and they were working together. Somehow in school, we got this idea that you could just be a programmer, and this is how I grew up, 100% programmer. I don't have to worry about ethics. I don't have to worry about beauty. I'm in a mathematical world and it's perfect. And that's why when I went to college, my mom's best friend, who is a math professor, said, you should get a degree in social science because you're bad at it. And if you really want to make things for people, you have to understand who people are. This is my favorite paper. So I found this paper when I was writing my thesis on cell phones in 2007. It said, the coming age of calm technology. At some point in the past, we had many devices, or many people sharing few devices, many people sharing one large mainframe computer. But in the future, they said in 1996, many devices will share each of us. And at that point, the scarce resource will no longer be technology. Technology will become cheap. The scarce resource will be attention. And how technology makes or breaks our attention will make or break that technology. This becomes really crucial because of how people misinterpreted this. So this quote, a good tool is an invisible tool, not this marketing concept of invisible tools everywhere doing everything for you. It's still a tool. It has to be used by a person alongside a human. By invisible, we mean that the tool doesn't intrude on your consciousness. You focus on the task and not the tool. When you read a book, you dissolve into the book. The interface is invisible. You hallucinate what's inside the pages. You fold the complexity in on itself and put it back on the shelf. It's an incredibly elegant tool. It's a piece of software and hardware. It doesn't need to be updated. It's a brilliant invention. It's just that all of these brilliant inventions, they're become so normal and so invisible that we don't notice them, and we don't notice their ingenuity, and we don't respect them in the same way that we respect a new technology. With a new technology, it's always the same amount of problems as the old one. We just don't know what the problems are yet, and so it becomes really fun. And if you're younger, you want everything new because you're new too, so why would you want to work with old technology? You can make fun of fax machines all you want, but they're actually really, really incredible technology. So how do we design calm technology? There's been some principles that Mark Weiser and John Seely Brown developed, and I started to expand on them. Mark Weiser died, and his research is rapidly disappearing from the web, so I've been collecting it and putting it onto a website for future use. One of the principles is that technology shouldn't be requiring all of our attention, just some of it, and only when necessary. If technology requires all of your attention, you're always in Chronos time. If it requires only attention when you need it, you can be more in human time. And if you're more in human time, you can come up with weird concepts that will help with climate change and all of these bizarre things that we're going to have to come up with. Or you might hang out with indigenous communities and actually ask them how they've dealt with it for their 5,000 at least years of history. This is an example of just a light switch. You can go home at night drunk, not know where the light switch is, and tap the wall until you find it. It's an easy thing to find all over the world. A 5-year-old could use it. You don't have to be an electrician to use it. You don't have to sign up for it. You don't have to use the anonymous mode. It's a light switch. Behind that is something that could kill you. And yet we have made this a domestic appliance that's reasonable and empowering. It's not invisible, it's passed through. And the idea of a pass-through technology is very interesting. You can still see it, you can still go behind the scenes of it with an electrician, but you don't have to call up Apple and ask them to fix it for you when it goes away, like you would if you had the Nest or something like that. It's still localized, it's still at human scale. You can still see it, you can still touch it, you can still understand the fundamentals behind it. Technology should be amplifying the best of tech and the best of humanity. We have all these movies from the 80s which were like, what happens if you have technology that does a human's job? Oh no, we have war games, we have the computer not understanding people. Every time a computer tries to be like a human, it ends up putting people on pause. Machines shouldn't be acting like humans, and humans shouldn't be acting like machines. No matter how many times we try to make an AI chatbot that seems like a human, it ends up failing in some terrible way. What I like about Google is not only is it a pass-through interface, but you're the one at the end of the search results that gets to make the decision on whether it's contextually relevant to you. It's not making the choice for you. And that's why they removed the I'm feeling lucky button, because it wasn't that correct all the time. So what does it mean to have humans alongside technology? It's the original concept of cybernetics. It's a feedback loop that gets better and better. Amplifying what humans do and amplifying what machines do well frees up human and machine time to do the best thing. So this is my friend Todd Huffman. He was sick of people in the lab taking biopsy skin samples and scanning them in by hand. Here they went to school to get their PhD and they were stuck in a lab for 3 years and they got repetitive stress injuries. He said, I'll automate that with a 3D slicing robot that automatically scans into a database. And then once everything's in the database, doctors and physicians can vote on whether the tumor became cancerous, how long it took, and over time that human-machine feedback loop can predict better than a single entity, like an expert doctor or a single AI system, and actually be together in this feedback loop and improve over time with constant new data. And I know we could call that big data or AI or whatever, but the optics and the aesthetics of AI, especially from films, is this idea of this perfect thing outside of humans that's an anomaly. It's been programmed by humans. So if we take into the account that the system is flawed and we improve the quality that goes into the system, which is improving the education of the people building the system and their idea of ethics and their worldviews, we can improve AI as a whole if we choose to consider keeping going down an automated pathway that's invisible and opaque. I like the idea from Japanese of omotenashi. It's from a tea ceremony. The idea in a tea ceremony is that the host should give you the thing right as you need it, just in time. How do you know when somebody needs something? Can you program a machine to do that? Or could you just have a lot of nice affordances? I think I have an example about this. Okay, let's see if I can play this. So here's a person in a train station in Japan, and he's demoing this system where if he gets confused and upset, here's a literal person that comes out of the wall right as he needs it and helps him with the system. I've had this happen plenty of times in Japan where they'll have a webcam with a very, very nice person talk to me. This is omotenashi in action. So you take something super traditional and you have this graceful person come out, help them out, and be done. So I love the idea of taking something from history and evolving it with an understanding of that history. Instead of saying, we're gonna build something new, we're not going to research any of the history of this technology. This company, MUI, got a hold of the Calm technology principles, and they made this piece of wood that you put on your wall, but you can tap on it and control your heat. It's very cute. What it's trying to do is integrate furniture design and traditional furniture design with high tech. now that people are in quarantine, they're trying to do things like this too. It's been interesting. All of it's in the idea of ambient awareness, again by Lisa Reichelt, that these particular designs, the street light, just this kind of iconography about toilets, for instance, that's from the Bauhaus movement. It's a 100-year-old movement that it was because of artists that we got this iconography. With streetlights, it's kind of punctuation for the streets. This is how you can tell when to go or when to stop. You're not thinking every stoplight, you're feeling the stoplight. And I think a lot of developers get trained like I did, which is thinking and judging. There are black and white answers. I must think and judge. I must rationalize. I must read the paper. It must be scientifically proven. Yet would you want to create a scientific paper to produce the perfect spaghetti? Or would you rather be part of a multi-generational family that's made spaghetti for 300 years and eat that and have a night of it for 4 hours? The difference is with some of these things is that this gives you a feeling of the temperature of the water just with light. It's kind of infosynesthesia. You don't have to see the number. Your brain doesn't have to look at it and say, this is the number, and translate it. A kid that's 3 can understand it's hot, it's cold. This is the type of technology that's interesting because it's nuanced. You're not going to write big research papers on it. It's just there. It's a pass-through, and it's about sensing and feeling. And of course, a lot of the technology that we build right now, when it fails 100%. If you put your phone in airplane mode, what can you really do except for notes and take photos? But when broken, escalators become stairs. What else in our lives that breaks can be easily mended at human scale by the individual? Or could you take it down the street to get repaired? I think of these radio and TV shops because people find them funny, but there are so many electrical engineers and mechanical engineers that grew up just working at these shops as kids, trying to figure out what it was, how to repair something, how to make something work. A lot of our technology is opaque and you have to have 80 or 100,000 people like Facebook work on it. But what are the kind of technologies that we can work on locally? So if this scarce resource is no longer technology and it's attention, then first we need to get our attention back. Second, we need to understand different perspectives through the role of Cosmotechnics. And 3, we need to understand how to make our own things for our own needs and not have it constantly be at a scale that's not empathetic, working under the kind of templated self of Facebook and Twitter and these large industrial objects. We should have more local things as we move forward. So if good design allows you to accomplish your goals in the least amount of moves, then called technology does the same thing, but with the least amount of mental cost. Because I agree here that unless you choose to, your primary task should be being human and not constantly computing. So I got pretty upset that Mark Weiser died and there wasn't a big website on this. So I made a site and I made a book just to try to get people to remember that there's a history in this here. At the very least here, there was a history in ethics and there was a history in privacy and security, and all these things were written about in at least as 1989. And when these things are pushed down and there's no people to dig them up, we lose not only millions of dollars of research, but we end up rehashing the same arguments again and again in a society that doesn't give us enough time for the perspective we need to put them into play. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Amber. That's really lots of food for thought, and I'm sure everyone on the line has lots of questions and lots of things I'd like more info on, so I do encourage them to ask questions. One thing that hits me is that you obviously have a real fondness for history, and its role in your work is so apparent. I mean, what are the implications for techies, and future techies, do you think, in terms of their education, and should we be re-looking at some of that? I just would appreciate your view.
Sure. I think about Stuart Butterfield, who has a degree in philosophy and then made Slack, but before that kept making all these gaming companies. The guy who made the Post-it note was a banjo player working at 3M. The African-American man who made microphone technology that's in 95% of microphones was just this, very strange person that against his family's wishes got a PhD and then showed up at Bell Labs very, very young and was given a space to come up with things. So I think really it's very hard for these things to come about, but these research institutes that have weird people alongside other people, they are actual representations of the world, right? If we're working with technology, it's just the latest layer to some history. And so if we ignore history when we look at technology, all the startups that I see that don't look at technology, they end up just failing. I mean, they just make the same mistake again and again. History has so many clues. I don't think technology changes very much. I don't think that humans change very much. I think that there are both human universals and technology universals. What do we do when we watch Netflix but watch rehashed Greek dramas again and again with modernized clothes? It's just a push through interface to get us to watch these things. We're still consuming the same stuff. We're still doing the same things. We still have the same wants and desires. And I was just watching, there's a retro computer show that I found on Twitch where they just stream stuff from the 80s and 90s and 70s, software demos. All the software demos are exactly the same thing as today, except ours just have CSS on them. If someone were to actually go and make HyperCard again, or go and make Douglas Engelbart's mother of all demos, those would be very helpful pieces of software. But they don't. They say, we're going to make this new company that does this thing that's totally new, and they come from a perspective that only has technology. They miss out on everything. And every once in a while, you get a company that does have a history and does have a childlike focus, or does have some weird artist that's involved, like Dennis Crowley from ITP at NYU making Foursquare, but he came from like the kind of geo-hacking gaming world. There was a bunch of underground artists. And then we have Bauhaus, who created all of our modern iconography. So it's really this untold story. I think, there's a critique of artists too, that a lot of artists say, oh, I'm not going to get into tech, it's terrible. But the ones that do can create really impactful, powerful things. But yes, they are, as the previous speaker, put it very well, they're at odds. And yeah, it's we have to come back to it. They actually did this paper at Park. They said, one UX person with a social sciences background and one developer can outperform a company of 20 because you don't need that much more. But these papers, no one goes to Xerox PARC's library and reads them. But if you did, you'd be able to make whatever you wanted. There's $1 billion company ideas all over the place about mundane things. Yet we keep having people make the same social networks again and again because media tells us that's what we need to make. We need to make a blockchain AI,
Yes, we actually started, I think it was Matt Beard actually started talking a bit about this whole move to, new is best. There was a question from Andrew Sims. And it's around the standards. Why no standards for tech when there are for electricity, which was your example? And do we need more Molly Russells to die for this to change?
Yep, 100%. I think we don't have tech standards like we do for electricity because nobody's died overtly. People have died indirectly or because of it in a long time frame. It also takes a long time for standards to get made. For instance, the radium girls who were, licking the brushes of the radioactive material used to paint watch dials so they could glow in the dark. It took them a very long time to bring any litigation against those groups, even though they fully knew that they were having their workers inhale those. The Titanic had to sink before we got standards in a lot of different ways for emergency protocols, radio SOS, things like that. With the recent civil rights issue that we saw starting in Minneapolis, somebody died. It was very obvious versus the healthcare issue where people are dying all the time, but there's not a symbolic death. I don't want there to be a symbolic death. It's still very abstract. You see people coding in a small condo in San Francisco. They don't go outside very much. They get all of their food delivered by Uber Eats. They go everywhere in an Uber. And then they panic, go down to South America and take ayahuasca to try to reconnect with the thing that they lost because they've been abstracted away. And the places they work just look like schools. You know, they want to have your laundry there. They want you to have everything so that you don't go out and think. And, you know, I had my own job offers from various defense companies upon graduating from high school. I took these very advanced programs and I said, yeah, this is great. Even though I was reading all the Richard Feynman books, all the stuff you're supposed to read. But it wasn't until my mom's friend was like, hey, learn something else, you know? Wouldn't it be interesting if you knew about people? I'm learning about design. It's terrible. It's so impossible.
Well, actually, I was going to go back to that advice. So I think from what I remember, she told you that if you want to build tech for people, you have to understand who they are. I mean, how do you suggest people go about that? I mean, we do have people, you know, listening to you now. I mean, what's your secrets? Sure.
Well, it's not fun because you have to be a kid and learn, like, pick the thing that you're terrible at. You know, for me, it's always about like, oh, I was bad at cooking. I was bad at beauty. Like this year is literally beauty, a thing that I would have never looked at before. What is beauty? What is harmony? I'm reading all these Japanese books on beauty. If you're an engineer and you need a black or white answer, go read a book from Japan that's going to be very prescriptive about leading you into a soft knowledge in a kind of tricky way. There's just the nuance where it seems like you're reading something that's like very specific and it's very well defined, and then you get this larger concept. It's very hard, but just read other cultures' materials. I have one good story. This woman who grew up in a tech family. She in India, I met her in India. She decided that she wanted to become a designer. So she looked up, what is a designer? And one of the things that it said was, designers have empathy. She said, well, what's empathy? So she went online and found what empathy was and started training herself in empathy and design, and holds a very high role now at Microsoft. And what the brilliant thing is, which we heard in the last speaker, is if you can have hybrids, if you have technologists that understand social sciences and art, which is critical and scary, and you have artists that understand, you know, creative technologies and things like that, not marketers, artists, which is uncomfortable questioning, right? Then you have a chance at making pretty amazing things. But, you know, having any artist come in, they're probably going to ask you a lot of questions about what you're doing and whether it means something. And if you've invested 20 million into it, you're probably not going to want to hear that. And I think secondly, like just how people build stuff. If you're building something and your room is not a representation of the population, as in you don't have somebody lower class in there, you don't have like, you know, anybody, then what's the point? You're making something for people that look like you and act like you. So like just Craigslist, you know, the guy Craig was annoyed because people kept asking him questions. So he made a script that generated a page for each question that came to his email, publicized it, and became Craigslist. And people make fun of it. They say Craigslist is really ugly. But the thing is, it works on any computer, anywhere in the world. Even if you have bad bandwidth, it's democratized. And people can take a piece of that and make an Airbnb out of it. They can make, you know, every single sector on it. But what it is it's just something that solves a problem. And we have to remember that, like, a lot of times we actually need a tool. We don't need a software solution that we sign up for with like gobs of our information and then it pings us all the time. We actually just need, and it's profitable too, to like make a light switch or to make a tire or something like that. So, yeah. Especially in this where we're at the moment, I suppose I think so much of what you're saying is just so needed. So thank you so much, Amber. I mean, as we were talking about earlier, this was the week we thought we would see you in the flesh in Australia, but things have got crazy. But we are hoping still that you'll be down, if not in October this year, next year, for
for continued conversations. But I just want to thank you so much. And I think the reminder for my team, I've seen a few things coming through on my private Slack around the tiny joys, and you definitely were a joy for us today. And thank you for all the reminders. And yeah, all the best. And we're going to thank you and welcome Zena at 10:45. Everyone stay tuned and please join with me in thanking Amber. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.